Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. Human Rights Watch published a new report that exposes a large-scale campaign to silence Palestinian political dissenters, journalists, and activists, not only in Israel, that they've reported on before, but in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. And while this report does not focus on the Israeli occupation forces, it does critique the two Palestinian governments, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, that's in the occupied West Bank, and the Hamas government in Gaza. The report records arbitrary arrests of activists for organizing political protests, for voicing their opinion, for writing on social media, for writing critical stories and covering news about Palestinian leaders they don't like, going after students and teachers for demonstrating and other political activities on campuses that are critical of government policies. It appears that also the Gaza authorities are arresting people who align with the Palestinian Authority, while the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank detain Hamas allies and sympathizers. Once arrested, activists and journalists are reporting being frequently beaten, tortured, and interrogated about their political opinions. People are using force to extract Facebook passwords from prisoners, and that seems to be just the tip of the iceberg. Human Rights Watch also published a short video with some of the testimonies and main findings of their report. Let's watch a segment from that video.
كان المستهدف هو الناشط السياسي فقط. اليوم المستهدف هو كل صحفي وكل ناشط في مجال حرية الرأي والتعبير وكل ناشط في مجال اجتماعي وكل ناشط في مجال سياسي وكل مدون على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي أو غير مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي.
وكان طبعا عنده مجموعة أوراق طابعينهن من تعليقات أو يعني بوستات أنا عاملهم على الفيسبوك. أنت حكيت كذا؟ بقول له حكيت كذا. مين أنت؟ حكيت له أنا مواطن. حكى لي مين بيحكي لك؟ مين حكى لك إنه المواطن من حقه يحكي؟
رحنا اعتصمنا عن شركة الكهرباء وأنا من الشباب المسكوني. أنا زي أجوا مجموعة مليان، الباص كان عساكر من حماس مليان، يضربوا فيه في ظهري وكانوا يضحكوا.
Palestinian security forces detained independent journalist Jihad Barakat for taking a picture of Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah at an Israeli-controlled checkpoint.
أنا صحفي قمت بتوثيق مشهد يتعرض له كافة المواطنين في كل يوم في فلسطين، وهذا انتهاك بحق رئيس الوزراء وأنا قمت بتصويره. بقيت في الاعتقال في طول كرم وفي رام الله، بعد ذلك تم نقلي. بقيت في الاعتقال 4 أيام.
We're joined by Omar Shakir, who is the main author of the report. And Omar Shakir, welcome back to the Real News. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is an interesting kind of new twist in things. The Oslo agreements themselves stipulated that the Palestinian Authority's main role was to be to enforce Israeli security policies on the West Bank. And so both the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Hamas in Gaza were now accused of violating human rights of detainees and arresting opposition members. So I'm curious why Human Rights Watch chose to publish another report about it now. Well, what is the timing mean anything?
I think the timing is related to several things. First of all, last month we marked 25 years since the Oslo Accords, and it marked an opportunity to reflect on where Palestinian governance is today. And here's where it is. 25 years after Oslo, Palestinian authorities have gained limited power, but where they have autonomy, they've developed parallel police states. They've created a machinery of repression to stamp out dissent. Secondly, in recent years, Palestinian authorities have signed a range of human rights treaties and other major international conventions, and we really wanted to assess their conduct against these agreements like the Convention Against Torture. And secondly, we now have marked 11 years of effective divide between Hamas in Gaza and the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, marking time for us to reflect on what it looks like to be an opposition member or a dissident in either authority. I think as at a time in which we're questioning the current reality, 25 years after Oslo, 50 years plus post beginning of ugly Israeli occupation, and 70 years after the creation of the State of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba, it marked a time to see where we are and looking beyond isolated cases and really what is the reality of Palestinian systematic practice and institutions.
So I'm curious if you'd like to comment a little bit more about that, maybe just politically and kind of analytically. I mean, what do you think this means in terms of the overall struggle around for the Palestinians to gain a homeland, to get state authority of their own, to have their own independent nation, if the cooperation is that deep between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and the split is so deep and divisive between the Gazan government and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. I mean, and how does that tie in for you, why these arrests are taking place and the seeming torture is taking place being done by some Palestinian authorities?
Absolutely. Palestinians today face a unique predicament of being squeezed by multiple authorities, all intolerant of dissent. So you have Palestinians, of course, in the West Bank and Gaza that have their own sort of regional authorities that have a small degree of self-rule. And then, of course, they do this in the midst of an occupation that's characterized by systematic rights abuse, institutional discrimination, and really grave violations of international law. So if you're a Palestinian today in the West Bank, you both have to be worried based on your activism, including your nonviolent expression, of being detained by an Israeli army that has a history of carrying out arbitrary arrests, as well as a Palestinian Authority that acts in coordination in many cases with the Israeli government. So we document in our report, 149-page report, over 2 years, numerous Palestinians in the West Bank that cycled between Israeli and Palestinian Authority detention, often based on a similar set of allegations. So in essence, you have Palestinians, stuck between these two authorities, going after them both for similar sets of activities. So, at the end of the day, Palestinian officials are going around the world speaking about Palestinian rights at the same time that they're crushing dissent. What's important to remember here is, even if Israeli settlements are dismantled and the accompanying entrenched two-tier discriminatory system that treats Palestinians separately and unequally, Palestinian freedom will remain incomplete so long as these machineries of oppression remain intact. They very much often operate in conjunction. It's important to understand those intersections and the ways in which Palestinians really are being squeezed by multiple authorities.
So this kind of begs the next question, which is a little uncomfortable, but I heard this morning from one person. You've been personally targeted by the Israeli government, who's been trying to deport you because of your opinions and your work. And so when people say that you chose to write a report accusing two Palestinian governments in order to appease the Israelis and get them off your back, how do you respond to that?
Look, Human Rights Watch has been documenting arbitrary arrests and torture by the Palestinian authorities dating back to 1995. You can find our first report on these issues in 1995. I began this research project in fall of 2016, which is months before Israel ordered my deportation on accusations of support for boycotts. The reality is the main Israeli argument now, and we're still battling this in the courts, is that I and Human Rights Watch endorsed boycotts of Israel. We, in May, as these court hearings went forward, released a report documenting the role of Israeli banks in benefiting from and contributing to serious human rights abuses and calling for those banks to cease those activities. Of course, Human Rights Watch takes no position on boycotts, but we've continued to do. In June, we wrote a report documenting Israeli war crimes in Gaza related to the Great March of Return. We continue to do our work documenting abuses by all parties. I mean, we live in a climate where the space for rights defenders is shrinking by all authorities, but Human Rights Watch's research agenda is dictated by longstanding priorities and the objective of advancing human rights protections for all, and not appeasing one authority or the other.
And this is, well, I'm going to come back to the end, what this might all mean politically, because I think setting this up and watching Palestinian democracy activists and what their next steps could be is really fascinating, given your report. But it also seems that the Palestinian Authority and the Gazan authorities appear to have, how would I put it, almost friendly responses to what you said, even though they completely denied that there was any torture going on, arrests. So what do you think is afoot there?
Sure. I mean, the response of the Palestinian authorities have varied. First of all, we welcome the fact that every implicated security agency responded to our detailed questions in advance of the publication of that report. Our methodology involves getting information from all parties, and our 149-page report includes almost 60 pages of responses from both the Hamas and the PA government. When we released this report, of course, earlier this week, we heard statements from both the PA and Hamas rejecting our report. In fact, there was a statement from the Interior Ministry of the Palestinian Authority initially that said that this report was part of the Trump administration's agenda of weakening the Palestinian Authority. But as time went on, and I think the Palestinian Authority considered the report over the course of the week, the Palestinian cabinet and Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah announced announced not only that they're going to study the report, review its recommendations, but that they're actually going to form investigative committees to look into the wrongdoing documented by the report. Of course, investigative committees are a dime a dozen, especially here in Palestine. But
not just Palestine, but everywhere.
The response that we heard. And, we do hope that the authority will take these allegations seriously. So I don't think it was the case of necessarily all welcoming remarks. I think the authority made it quite clear to us. And we met with members of the Palestinian Authority, the president's office, the Interior Ministry, the intelligence services, all in the last few days. And I would say all of them, in fact, the Interior Ministry said they reject our report in its entirety. They asked us initially to, retract the report and cancel our press conference. Ultimately, we were allowed to hold the press conference in Ramallah without incident, but I think it was a moving target. And I think ultimately the pressure here was important. And we do hope that the international community will continue to pressure both Hamas and the PA to stop arbitrarily arresting dissidents and to end its practice of systematic torture.
Well, do you see, given their responses, that there's any hope of that, A? And B, is there a difference between their response and responses you may get from the Israeli government on these similar issues?
Sure. I mean, in response to your second question, I think with the Israeli government, we're often able to get information when requested. But, the Israeli government, we just saw in the last few weeks, their attack on B'Tselem, calling them collaborators and really harshly criticizing them, accusing them of slander, in essence, for their human rights advocacy. We've seen elements of that, obviously, in the Palestinian Authority response, but we welcome the fact that, the government put out this statement acknowledging the seriousness of our findings. We haven't seen that from the Israeli government. Look, as a human rights activist, we're always optimistic. We always hope for a better outcome. But the reality is these are long-standing issues, especially torture, as I say, that date back to the founding of the Palestinian Authority, and for Hamas, date back to the beginning of its effective rule in Gaza. Ultimately, I think what's needed at this stage is for the international community, especially donor states that provide security assistance to Palestinian security services, to understand that, while they may be speaking of developing the Palestinian rule of law, in some cases that funding is going to institutions that are actively stamping out dissent and violating the law. In fact, committing acts that may arise to crimes against humanity. So I think it's time that there's a different international response. I think without that, you'll likely see continuation of serious abuses and lack of accountability.
So while there's kind of clear opposition to the occupation from both Palestinian governments, on especially national and international levels, it appears that the Fatah government of Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah actually really works very closely with Israeli security forces, arresting people as they come out of Israeli prisons, putting them in Palestinian prisons, helping people go be arrested, to be put back or be put into Israeli prisons, and working with Israeli security forces, re-arresting people. And this was also part of your report, giving names of political dissenters to the Israeli authorities. There are a couple of questions here. A, your analysis of why that's happening. And some people argue, I've heard argued this morning, that Human Rights Watch holds Palestinian security forces to kind of a higher standard than it does the Israeli security forces. How do you respond to those two things?
No, I think first of all, it's well documented that the Palestinian Authority engages in security coordination with Israel. There's not a lot of clarity of what that means in practice, but we do know, as we said, that Palestinians in the West Bank often cycle between Israeli and Palestinian Authority custody. I think the reality is here, the Oslo Accords, in essence, institutionalize an arrangement where the primary objective of the Palestinian Authority was, almost as a condition of statehood, to provide security for Israel and Israeli citizens. And I think, for over 2 decades now, the Palestinian Authority has sold the Palestinian people on the idea that the path to their freedom and rights protection lies in a negotiated agreement, with the United States as a mediator, and proving that they can essentially be a state, and a huge part of that is providing security for Israel. And I think that that entire framework, in many ways, the Trump-Netanyahu agenda has accelerated and put into focus. And of course, I think I reject your second set of allegations. The reality is the Israeli government is has ordered my deportation for my advocacy work and documentation of Israeli rights abuses. As I said, Human Rights Watch has long said that settlements are war crimes. We've called for the International Criminal Court to open a formal investigation into crimes committed in Palestine. We've accused the Israeli forces, as recently as June, of committing war crimes in Gaza with documented evidence. We've called for businesses to cease doing business in or with settlements. We've documented deeply entrenched institutional discrimination against Palestinians across not only the West Bank and Gaza, but inside Israel itself. The reality is we document rights abuses of all parties, regardless of who it is. If somebody is violating international law or human rights in Israel or Palestine, we're documenting those abuses. And it's funny that each side accuses us of the, anytime you write a report here, you're going to have one of the three authorities, Hamas, the PA, or Israel, that welcomes it, and you're going to have one or two that reject it and say that it is biased, or you're not focusing on the other side. But I think the reality is we use the same methodology, the same tactics, and we will document those abuses, whoever the wrongdoer is.
So finally here, I want to ask this question about people being arrested. It appears that on one hand, many of the people being arrested by the PA and the West Bank are sympathizers or work with Hamas. And in the Gaza, you're seeing many Fatah sympathizers and people who support the PA being arrested in Gaza. And other people are being arrested as well. So if you could describe it in a bit more detail for our viewers now, just who is being arrested here? And I know it's the opposition, but it also seems to be people who are dissenting, who are not part of either the PA's world or Hamas's world.
Sure. So I think both authorities are systematically, arbitrarily detaining dissidents or critics. So what does that mean, as you ask? It means people who post criticism on social media, on Facebook, journalists who write critical articles, demonstrators, university students. Many of those individuals are ones that one authority perceives as affiliated vaguely with or a supporter of the other current, so Hamas or Islamist supporters in the West Bank, or Fatah supporters or former PA employees in Gaza. But it also includes, I think we've seen an expansion in the last 2-3 years. And that's the context for writing our report, that it's gone beyond merely political opposition. And we're seeing everyday citizens who post commentary critical of the authorities being rounded up. Once in detention, not only these more political cases, but even in routine cases, we see routine mistreatment, beating, and torture, including foot whipping and, putting detainees in painful stress positions for hours at a time. And these abuses are systematic, and systematic torture as part of a government policy is a crime against humanity. And we found that these abuses may well rise to the threshold of being crimes against humanity prosecutable at the International Criminal Court.
I'd be curious how this politically kind of plays out over the coming years and what this means for the future of a Palestinian state as well, because all this will feed into that. This has been fascinating, and I appreciate the work you do and the report you did. Omar Shakir joins us from Ramallah and the occupied West Bank and wrote this report for Human Rights Watch. Omar, thanks so much for joining us here in The Real News. Look forward to talking to you again soon, and stay safe.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'm Mark Steiner here for The Real News Network. Thanks for joining us. Take care.